You're going to want to remember this moment, the woman said quietly, her voice steady against the distant hum of traffic and the rhythmic flash of red and blue lights washing over the wet pavement. Officer Daniel Brooks didn't slow down. His boots splashed through shallow puddles as he closed the last few feet between them, his breath controlled, his posture rigid with certainty. The woman stood near the edge of the sidewalk, hands visible, shoulders relaxed, a dark coat pulled tight against the chill of the night air. Streetlights reflected off the thin sheen of rain on the asphalt, turning the entire block into a mirror of shifting gold and red. Around them, a small crowd had begun to gather, phones raised, whispers threading through the air like static. Brooks reached her in one decisive motion, guiding her down to a controlled position against the ground, his voice firm, rehearsed, authoritative. "Stay still," he said, each word clipped, practiced. She didn't resist, not even a flinch. Her cheek hovered just above the cold surface, her eyes open, calm, focused somewhere beyond him. The silence that followed felt heavier than the sirens in the distance. Someone in the crowd murmured. A car door slammed somewhere behind the flashing lights. Brooks secured her wrists with precise efficiency, the metal catching a brief glint from the cruiser's headlights. "You're interfering with an active situation," he added, louder now, as if narrating the moment for every camera pointed his way. The woman exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cool air, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "You might want to check who you're detaining." Brooks gave a short, humorless laugh under his breath, the kind that came from years of believing he had already seen everything worth seeing. "I know exactly what I'm doing," he replied, tightening his grip just enough to assert control without escalation. The crowd shifted, a ripple of tension passing through them. A young man stepped closer, phone raised higher, capturing every second. Another voice called out, uncertain, hesitant, but it faded quickly under the weight of authority. The woman's gaze didn't waver. Rain tapped, lightly against the pavement now, a soft, steady rhythm that seemed to slow everything down. Brooks reached toward her coat pocket, conducting a routine check, his movements methodical, unhurried. His fingers brushed against something rigid, a card, maybe. He pulled it free just enough to glimpse its surface. The lettering was partially obscured, the name blurred by moisture, the seal indistinct in the flashing light. He frowned, just for a fraction of a second, then dismissed it, sliding it back without a second thought. "Nice try," he muttered, more to himself than to her. She said nothing. Somewhere in the distance, a vehicle approached, its engine low, controlled, different from the chaotic urgency of patrol cars. The headlights cut clean lines through the rain, steady and deliberate. Brooks didn't look up. Not yet. He adjusted his stance, anchoring himself in the moment, in control, in charge. But the woman's stillness, her complete, unshaken composure, lingered like something he couldn't quite place. The rain grew slightly heavier, dotting the pavement, softening the edges of sound. And for the first time since he stepped onto that street, something subtle shifted, not in his grip, not in his voice, but somewhere quieter, somewhere deeper, where certainty usually lived. Daniel Brooks had learned long ago that control was not just about physical presence. It was about narrative, about owning the version of events before anyone else could question it. And as the rain continued to fall in thin, steady lines, he straightened his shoulders slightly, projecting calm authority to the growing circle of onlookers whose phone screens glowed like small, floating windows in the dark. The woman beneath his hands remained still, not tense, not afraid, just present in a way that felt almost deliberate, as if she had chosen this exact position, this exact moment, and that quiet certainty pressed against the edges of his awareness in a way he could not immediately explain. He glanced briefly over his shoulder, scanning the perimeter, noting the angles, the witnesses, the way his patrol car lights painted everything in alternating colors, red then blue then red again, each pulse. Freezing the scene into fragments of memory, one of the bystanders spoke up, voice uncertain but audible, asking if everything was okay, and Brooks responded without hesitation, his tone firm and measured, stating that the situation was under control, that procedure was being followed, that there was nothing to worry about, and the words came easily because they always had, because repetition had turned them into something close to instinct. Still, The woman's earlier statement lingered, not loud, not confrontational, but precise, like a detail placed exactly where it needed to be. He shifted slightly, adjusting his stance to maintain balance on the slick pavement. And in doing so he noticed again the small, almost invisible device tucked just behind her ear, something most people would have missed entirely, something that did not belong in an ordinary encounter like this. He leaned in a fraction, his voice dropping just enough to keep the exchange contained between them, asking her what she meant by her earlier comment. And for the first time since the moment began, she turned her head just slightly, not enough to break position, but enough for him to catch the calm clarity in her eyes. "You are not seeing the full picture," she said, her tone even, unhurried, as if time itself had slowed around her. Brooks frowned, not in confusion but in irritation at the implication, because uncertainty was something he did not allow to take root, and yet it brushed against him. Again, when he replayed the feel of that identification card in his hand, the weight of it, the unusual texture, the way the seal had not immediately registered. Another vehicle rolled closer now, its engine quieter than the others, its headlights cutting through the rain with a steady, unwavering beam, and this time Brooks noticed, his attention shifting just enough to register that this arrival did not match the pattern of routine backup. He inhaled slowly, grounding himself, reminding himself that situations often attracted attention, that not every anomaly meant something larger, and yet the rhythm of the moment had changed, subtle but undeniable, like a shift in pressure before a storm. The woman did not speak again, but she did not need to, because her stillness had already begun to reshape the space around them. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel Brooks found himself not fully certain that he was the one defining what happened next. The low hum of the approaching vehicle settled into the scene like a controlled breath, steady and deliberate, and as it rolled to a stop at the edge of the flashing lights, its presence carried a different kind of weight, not urgent, not chaotic, but precise, as if it had arrived exactly when it intended to. Daniel Brooks felt it before he fully understood it, a subtle shift in the way the air seemed to hold itself, in the way a few of the bystanders instinctively lowered their voices without knowing why, and he turned his head just enough to catch the reflection of the vehicle's dark exterior in the rain-slick pavement, its doors still closed, its engine idling quietly. The woman beneath him did not react, not outwardly, but something in her breathing changed, not faster, not slower, just aligned, as if the moment had reached a point she had already anticipated. Brooks straightened slightly, maintaining control but allowing himself a clearer line of sight, his training telling him to assess, to categorize, to remain in command of every variable. Yet this variable did not fit neatly into any category he trusted. The driver's side door opened with a soft, controlled motion, and a figure stepped out, dressed in a dark coat that fell cleanly to mid-calf, movements measured, posture upright, the kind of presence that did not need to announce itself to be noticed. The figure did not rush, did not raise a voice, simply walked forward through the light rain with a purpose that felt rehearsed yet natural, each step landing with quiet certainty. Brooks felt the eyes of the crowd shift, their attention pulling away from him and toward this new arrival, and that shift, small as it was, pressed against his sense of authority. "This is an active scene," he called out, projecting his voice just enough to reassert control, but the words did not carry the same weight they had moments before. The approaching figure stopped a few feet away, just outside the arc of the flashing lights, and for a brief second everything seemed to pause, the rain, the murmurs, even the distant traffic fading into the background. The woman on the ground spoke again, her voice still calm, still steady, but now there was something else beneath it, something that felt less like a warning and more like confirmation. "You should listen," she said quietly. Brooks felt a flicker of irritation, sharp and brief, because listening was not what he had been trained to do in moments like this, not when control was at stake, not when uncertainty threatened to spread. He glanced once more at the small device near her ear, then at the partially seen identification he had dismissed too quickly, and for the first time a question formed that he could not immediately answer. The figure in the dark coat reached into an inside pocket with slow, deliberate movement, producing a badge that caught the light in a clean, unmistakable way, the kind of Detail that did not need explanation once seen. Brooks did not yet react, not fully, but his grip eased by a fraction, not from hesitation but from something deeper, a recalibration that had begun without his permission. The rain continued to fall, soft but persistent, tapping against metal, fabric, and pavement alike, and in that steady rhythm, the moment stretched just enough for doubt to settle into the edges of certainty, quiet, patient, and impossible to ignore. The badge caught the light in a way that was impossible to ignore, its edges sharp, its surface clean despite the rain, and for a brief second Daniel Brooks felt his focus narrow to that single object as if the entire scene had collapsed into it. The figure holding it did not move closer, did not raise their voice, simply kept it visible, steady, allowing recognition to arrive on its own terms. Brooks blinked once, then again, his mind running through protocol, through rank structures, through every scenario he had trained for, and none of them aligned cleanly with what stood in front of him now. "Officer," the figure said, voice calm, controlled, carrying the kind of authority that did not need volume to be heard. "You are going to release her now." The words were not a suggestion, not a negotiation, and something in the tone pressed against Brooks's instincts in a way that bypassed resistance and went straight to assessment. The crowd had gone quieter, phones still raised but movement slower, as if everyone sensed that the moment had shifted into something more serious than a routine encounter. Brooks felt the weight of their attention, the presence of the cameras, the echo of his own earlier certainty, and he held his position for just a fraction longer, not out of defiance but out of habit, the need to reconcile what he was seeing with what he believed. The woman beneath him spoke again, her voice low, steady, unchanged from the beginning. "This is where it changes," she said, and there was no emotion in it, no anger, no urgency, just a simple statement of fact. Brooks exhaled slowly, his grip easing as his attention moved fully to the badge again, to the details he had missed before, the clarity of the insignia, the authenticity that could not be faked easily, and then to the small device near her ear, now unmistakably part of something larger. He reached for the identification card once more, this time more carefully, turning it slightly so the light struck it differently, and the blurred edges from before resolved into something clearer, the name emerging in sharp, undeniable print. For a moment, everything inside him stilled, the practiced responses, the automatic commands, all of it pausing as the pieces aligned in a way that could not be undone. The rain continued to fall, soft but constant, tapping against his uniform, against the pavement, against the quiet tension that now filled the space. He removed the restraints with controlled, deliberate movement, not rushed, not hesitant, but precise, as if correcting a step in a process that had gone off course. The woman rose smoothly, brushing a small trace of moisture from her sleeve, her posture unchanged, her expression composed, and when she met his eyes there was no accusation in them, only a steady awareness that seemed to look straight through the moment and beyond it. The figure in the dark coat stepped slightly closer, lowering the badge but not the authority behind it, and Brooks straightened fully now, the shift in posture subtle but complete, his earlier certainty replaced with something quieter, something more careful. The woman spoke one final time in that same calm tone. "You were never supposed to see me." And the words settled into the space between them like a truth that had been waiting all along, leaving Brooks standing in the rain, aware that the moment he thought he controlled had been something entirely different from the beginning. For a few seconds, no one moved, not the crowd, not the figure in the dark coat, not even Daniel Brooks, who stood there with his hands now empty, the absence of resistance more unsettling than anything that had come before. The flashing lights continued their rhythm, painting the scene in alternating colors, but the energy had shifted completely, no longer driven by command but by observation, as if every person present understood they were witnessing something that extended beyond a routine street encounter. Brooks felt the weight of his own breath, steady but heavier now, his training urging him to regain structure, to restore order, yet every instinct told him that the structure had already been rewritten without his knowledge. The woman, Ava Coleman, adjusted the collar of her coat with a small, deliberate motion, rain sliding off the fabric in thin lines, her composure intact, untouched by the tension that had just unfolded, and when she spoke again, Her voice carried not confrontation but clarity. "This was not random," she said, her eyes steady on him. "And it was not just about tonight." Brooks swallowed, a subtle motion, almost invisible, as pieces began to fall into place, fragments of past reports, internal briefings, conversations that had seemed routine at the time, but now felt like parts of a pattern he had not been meant to see. One of the bystanders lowered their phone slightly, sensing the shift, while another stepped back, the quiet ripple of awareness moving through the crowd. The figure beside Ava stepped forward just enough to establish presence, their badge now lowered but still visible, a silent reminder of the authority that had entered the scene. "Officer Brooks," the figure said, voice calm but unmistakably firm. "Your actions tonight have been documented as part of an ongoing federal review." And the words settled into the air with a weight that did not need to be repeated. Brooks felt something tighten in his chest, not fear exactly, but recognition. The realization that the moment he believed he controlled had been observed, measured, and recorded from the very beginning. His gaze flicked briefly to the small device near Ava's ear, then to the patrol car, to the body camera mounted on his uniform, and suddenly every detail seemed amplified, every second replaying in his mind with a clarity that left no room for reinterpretation. "You were being evaluated," Ava added, her tone unchanged, not accusing, not emotional, simply factual, not just for procedure, but for judgment. The rain softened slightly, turning from steady taps into a lighter mist, and in that quiet shift, Brooks became aware of how still everything had become, how the usual noise of the city had faded into the background, leaving only the sound of his own thoughts aligning with a reality he had not anticipated. He straightened fully now, not out of authority but out of instinct, a reflex shaped by years of training. Yet this time it felt different, less like control and more like acknowledgement. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice lower, measured, no longer projecting but seeking clarity. Ava held his gaze for a moment, then glanced briefly toward the figure beside her before returning her attention to him. "Now," she said, "the truth continues without interruption." And with that, the scene remained suspended in a quiet, undeniable understanding that nothing about this night would be dismissed, and nothing about it would be forgotten. The rain softened into a fine mist that hovered in the air rather than falling, blurring the edges of the streetlights and turning every surface into something reflective, something quiet. And for the first time since the moment began, Daniel Brooks noticed the sound of his own breathing as if it had been absent until now. No one in the crowd spoke, the earlier murmurs replaced by a stillness that felt deliberate, almost respectful, as if the weight of what had been revealed required space to settle. Ava Coleman stepped slightly away from him, not distancing herself out of avoidance, but repositioning with intention, her movements controlled, measured, every detail aligned with a purpose that extended beyond the scene itself. The figure beside her remained steady, eyes scanning the perimeter with quiet awareness, not intervening. Further, simply ensuring that nothing disrupted the shift that had already taken place. Brooks lowered his hands to his sides, the gesture small but meaningful, the absence of action now more powerful than anything he had done before. And as he stood there, the earlier certainty that had guided him began to dissolve into something more complex, something that required him to look beyond instinct and into reflection. The flashing lights continued, but they no longer dominated the moment, instead becoming part of the background, a reminder of where the encounter had started rather than where it was now. Ava glanced briefly at the surrounding bystanders, her gaze acknowledging their presence without engaging it, then returned to Brooks, her expression unchanged, calm but not distant, firm but not harsh. "You were not selected by chance," she said, her voice even, each word placed carefully. "Patterns are never random, and neither are decisions." Brooks felt the statement settle into him, not as accusation but as recognition, and he found himself replaying small details, moments he had dismissed, interactions that now carried a different weight when viewed through this lens. A drop of water slid from the brim of his cap, tracing a line down to his collar, and he did not move to wipe it away, the physical sensation grounding him in a moment that felt both immediate and far-reaching. The street seemed quieter now, the distant traffic muted, the city continuing its rhythm while This one point in time remained suspended. Ava took a slow breath, not out of strain but out of control, and continued. The way you act when you believe no one is watching reveals more than any report ever could. Brooks nodded once, almost imperceptibly, not in agreement but in acknowledgement, the kind that comes when something undeniable has been placed in front of you. The figure beside her shifted slightly, speaking just enough to anchor the moment in reality. All footage has been secured, they said, their tone steady, procedural, reinforcing that what had happened was not fleeting, not subject to interpretation, but documented with clarity. Brooks glanced briefly at his own body camera, the small device that had always been a routine part of his uniform, and for the first time he understood it not just as a tool, but as a mirror. The mist hung in the air, softening the scene, and in that quiet space between action and consequence, nothing needed to be rushed, nothing needed to be forced, because the truth, once present, did not require volume to be heard. A long moment passed where no one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that mattered had already been revealed, and the weight of it needed space to settle into something real. Daniel Brooks stood in that space, the faint mist collecting along the edges of his uniform, the distant glow of streetlights reflecting across the wet pavement like a memory replaying itself in fragments. And for the first time in years, he was not thinking about procedure, not thinking about command, but about consequence. Ava Coleman watched him without urgency, her posture steady, her presence grounded in a calm that did not demand attention yet held it completely. And when she finally spoke again, her voice carried a different tone now, not just observation, but resolution. This was never about catching you in a single moment, she said, her words measured, deliberate. It was about understanding the pattern behind the moment. Brooks felt the statement land deeper than anything before it, because it did not isolate what had happened, it connected it, stretched it across time in a way that removed any chance of dismissing it as isolated or misunderstood. The figure beside her took a small step forward, just enough to align with her, reinforcing the shift from observation to action, and their voice followed, calm but definitive. The review does not end here, Officer Brooks, it expands from here. The phrase lingered in the air, not loud, not dramatic, but final in a way that did not require emphasis. Brooks nodded once, slowly, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement that the path ahead had already begun, and there was no version of this where he returned unchanged. A bystander lowered their phone completely now, the need to record replaced by a quiet understanding that the moment had moved beyond spectacle, becoming something more serious, something that would not be resolved on the street in front of them. Ava shifted her gaze briefly toward the vehicle that had arrived, then back to Brooks, her expression unchanged, still composed, still steady, but now carrying a subtle sense of closure. You still have a choice, she said, her tone even, not offering escape, but clarity. Not about what already happened, but about what you do after it. Brooks let out a slow breath, the kind that settles deeper than the lungs, and for a second, the world around him seemed to narrow to just that single idea, that whatever came next would define more than anything that came before. The mist in the air caught the light again, softening the edges of the scene, and in that quiet shift, the flashing red and blue lights felt distant, almost irrelevant, as if they belonged to a different version of the moment entirely. The figure beside Ava turned slightly, signaling without words that it was time to move forward, not in haste, not with urgency, but with purpose. Ava gave one final look, not at the crowd, not at the surroundings, but directly at Brooks, and there was no anger there, no triumph, just a clear, unwavering sense of truth. Then she stepped back, allowing space to open again, the kind of space that exists after something has been fully revealed, where nothing needs to be forced because everything has already been seen. Brooks remained where he was, aware now, of every detail, every sound, every reflection on the wet pavement, and as the scene began to shift around him, he understood that this was not the end of the moment, but the point where it truly began to matter. The air did not rush back into motion. It unfolded slowly, like a scene that understood it no longer belonged to urgency, and Daniel Brooks stood at the center of that quiet shift, no longer directing it, no longer shaping it, simply existing within it, as everything around him moved with a purpose he had not set. Ava Coleman turned slightly toward the dark vehicle. The subtle movement enough to signal transition without breaking the stillness that held the moment together, and the figure beside her mirrored that shift, their posture remaining composed, their attention precise, as if every second was being placed exactly where it needed to be. The bystanders began to step back, not out of fear, but out of recognition, the instinctive understanding that what had just unfolded was no longer theirs to witness, that it belonged to something larger, something structured and deliberate. Brooks watched as one phone lowered, then another, the glowing screens dimming one by one, and in that small change, the sense of exposure remained, but it transformed into something internal, something that did not rely on an audience to exist. Ava paused before taking another step, her gaze returning to him one last time, not searching, not questioning, simply present, and when she spoke, her voice carried a quiet finality. Accountability does not begin when someone is caught. It begins when someone chooses to see clearly. The words settled without resistance, not because they demanded agreement, but because they reflected something already forming beneath the surface. Brooks felt the meaning of them extend beyond the moment, beyond the street, reaching into places he had not examined closely before, and for the first time, the idea of control felt less important than the idea of understanding. The figure beside Ava opened the rear door of the vehicle, the motion smooth, practiced, not hurried, and she stepped toward it with the same measured pace she had carried from the beginning, unaffected by the tension that had surrounded her, grounded in a clarity that did not need reinforcement. Brooks remained still, his posture no longer rigid, no longer projecting authority, but aligned with a different kind of awareness, one that did not rely on command, but on reflection. The rain had nearly stopped now, leaving only a faint trace in the air, the pavement still wet, still reflective, capturing the fading flashes of red and blue lights as they softened into the background. The figure turned back briefly, their voice calm, procedural. "You will be contacted with next steps." And the statement carried the weight of continuation, not closure, a reminder that what had happened here was part of something ongoing, something that would move forward regardless of how the moment felt. Brooks gave a slight nod, not in response to instruction, but in acknowledgement of reality, the kind that does not ask for permission. Ava stepped into the vehicle, her presence disappearing into the dim interior, and the door closed with a quiet, definitive sound that echoed more in meaning than in volume. The engine shifted, the headlights adjusted, and the vehicle began to move. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the same steady purpose it had arrived with. Brooks watched it go, the reflection of its movement stretching across the wet street, and as it faded from view, the space it left behind did not feel empty. It felt changed, as if something unseen had been revealed and could no longer be ignored. The patrol lights continued to flash, but they no longer defined the scene. They simply existed within it, while Brooks stood there, aware that the moment had already moved beyond him, carrying with it a truth that would not be undone. The street did not return to normal all at once. It settled slowly, like a surface of water after something heavy has passed through it, and Daniel Brooks remained standing exactly where he was. The fading echo of the departing vehicle still reflected in the wet pavement beneath his boots. The flashing red and blue lights from his patrol car continued their rhythm, but now they felt distant, almost detached from him, as if they belonged to a version of the moment that had already ended. The bystanders were nearly gone, their presence dissolving into the night, footsteps soft against the damp sidewalk, voices low and indistinct, leaving behind a silence that felt fuller than the noise that had come before. Brooks reached up instinctively and touched the small camera mounted on his uniform, his fingers brushing against it lightly, aware now of its quiet, constant presence, aware that every second had been captured without interpretation, without bias, just as it happened. He lowered his hand slowly, the motion unhurried, his gaze drifting across the street, taking in details he had overlooked earlier, the reflection of streetlights stretching across puddles, the faint hum of distant traffic, the lingering trace of mist in the air. Everything looked the same, and yet nothing felt the same. He stepped back once, then stopped, not because he was unsure of where to go, but because movement itself no longer carried the same urgency, the same automatic certainty. His breathing remained steady, but deeper now, more deliberate, as if each inhale carried weight, and each exhale released something he had not fully recognized before. The words Ava had spoken replayed in fragments, not as accusations, but as reflections, each one settling into place with a clarity that did not demand agreement, only acknowledgement. He glanced down at the pavement where she had been moments earlier, the surface still damp, still marked by the presence of the moment, and he understood, quietly, that nothing physical had changed there, but everything else had. The patrol radio crackled faintly from inside the vehicle, a routine dispatch call breaking through the silence, a reminder that the world continued moving, that there were still procedures to follow, still responsibilities waiting. But for a moment, he did not respond. Instead, he stood there, allowing the stillness to remain, allowing the absence of noise to carry meaning. A light breeze moved through the street, barely noticeable, just enough to shift the mist, to ripple the reflections on the pavement. And in that small movement, something inside him aligned, not with control, not with authority, but with awareness. He turned slowly toward his patrol car, the familiar shape now carrying a different weight, not just a tool, but a symbol of something that required more than routine. He walked toward it with measured steps, each one grounded, each one intentional. And when he reached the door, he paused again, his hand resting lightly on the handle. For a brief second, he closed his eyes, not in hesitation, but in recognition, the kind that does not erase what came before, but reshapes what comes next. Then he opened the door, the motion quiet, controlled, and as he sat inside, the interior light flickered on, illuminating his face. For just a moment before dimming again. Outside, the last trace of mist faded into the night, the street returning to its steady rhythm. But the silence that remained was not empty. It carried something deeper, something that could be felt even after the